Policing white supremacy, the enemy within. Both those phrases could be subject to some ambiguity. Why this title?
My co-author, Beth Zasloff, was something very simple and explained what the book is really trying to do. So Policing White Supremacy is about how law enforcement is ineffective in the way it addresses white supremacist and far-right militant violence, with instruction on how they can improve that performance, and more importantly, to recognize that it isn't just a law enforcement issue. This is something that giving law enforcement more powers isn't going to solve. In fact, that's part of the problem. And the enemy within was intentionally ambiguous, both because it somewhat references the idea that the way that law enforcement looks at white supremacist activity as a domestic issue when it's really international. There are white supremacists all over the world. These groups that engage in violence often network internationally. So this distinction, calling them domestic terrorists versus international terrorists, is part of the discrepancy in the way law enforcement addresses terrorism in the United States. But also the other ambiguous part is that a lot of the book focuses on affinity for these groups within law enforcement. So it's not just that these groups are outside law enforcement and need to be addressed by law enforcement, but that this is a problem that has festered within law enforcement since the beginning of history in this country.
Well, and many of our, certainly in the South in particular, many of the police departments started out as slave patrols, and as did, Patrick Henry gave a big speech about this at the ratifying convention for the Constitution, that without what became the Second Amendment, without something that explicitly authorized states to have militias and arm those militias, and he was specifically referring to the Virginia Slave Patrol. He was the largest owner of slaves in the state. That he wouldn't vote for the Constitution. So arguably even the state militias, what we call the National Guard, started out as the slave patrols. The white supremacy and its involvement with police, it goes way back, not just to the 1870s when the Justice Department came out of the effort to push back against the Klan and the fight against Reconstruction, if I've got that right.
Absolutely, and it's easy to look at that as a remnant of history, but it persists. And after the Reconstruction period ended and Jim Crow laws were put in place and black codes all across the United States, it's often easy to assume this is a southern U.S. problem, but fugitive slave patrols went all across the nation. And during Jim Crow, there were also black codes in Midwestern states and northern states. Vigilante groups like the Ku Klux Klan were powerful in Southern California. So this has never been just a regional problem. It's always been within the entire country in the way that our society creates racial hierarchies, and the police are the ones who enforce those hierarchies. The towns where a person of color is met on one side of the town by a police officer who takes them to the other side of the town and says, don't be here past sundown. These laws and policies were always enforced by police.
So part of this has to do with how we define, in the modern context, how we define terrorism. This is the word du jour since 9/11, and or the word decade or whatever.
Right.
And here we've got this guy who blew himself up in front of the Trump Hotel in Las Vegas, left behind two manifestos. One of them said, fellow service members, veterans, and Americans, it's time to wake up. Americans only pay attention to spectacles and violence. What better way to get my point across than with fireworks and explosives? Rally around Trump, Musk, Kennedy, and ride this wave to the highest hegemony for all Americans. He says, Americans must wake up, purge the government and military, Military and vets must move on D.C. Militias facilitate and augment this activity until the purge is complete. He said, try peaceful means first, but prepare to fight to get the Dems out of the federal government and military by any means necessary. They all must go, and a hard reset must occur for our country to avoid collapse. If he was speaking not of Republican Democratic politics, but instead on behalf of Islam, and he had brown skin, he would have been labeled a terrorist instantly. And instead, I have not heard one single news report refer to this guy as a terrorist. What's going on with this?
That's right. The way that not just law enforcement, but the media talk about terrorism is highly politicized, and that's really part of the problem. As you said, it comes definitionally. This concept of terrorism is a highly politicized term, where it's applied not based on the type of conduct, but rather based on whether the government has a concern about that political cause or social movement, which is why you see the law enforcement response to activism that is meant to drive social change, particularly when it's led by people of color in this country, receive a tremendous amount of law enforcement attention, whereas white supremacist violence isn't even tallied. Yeah. For years, we've been, and in fact, Congress passed a law requiring the FBI to document the number of domestic terrorism incidents, including breaking it down by white supremacists and the fatalities resulting thereof. And the FBI, as you said, for 25 years now, we've considered terrorism our number one priority, counterterrorism our number one priority, but they say that they don't collect domestic terrorism incident data. They don't know how many people white supremacists killed this year, or last year, or any other year.
I want to get to your experience being undercover with these people, but it seems to me that it's not just race, that it's almost a caste system, certainly a class system. I mean, you've got obviously, race a big factor in this one. Dylan Roof killing a half a dozen people, black people in a church, and the police drive him to a Burger King because he says he's hungry, he hasn't had lunch, on the way to jail. And then you contrast that with, Luigi, who shot a white multimillionaire CEO, and they march him to jail with a phalanx. I mean, with a military escort virtually, as if he was Osama bin Laden. The contrast is frankly shocking. And they never prosecuted Dylan Roof as a terrorist, as I recall. I think he was just prosecuted for murder, whereas Luigi is being prosecuted for terrorism as well. What does that tell you?
Well, it tells me there's a differentiation in how the FBI and the Justice Department address white supremacist violence. And part of that comes from the history. One of the frustrations I've had over the last several years is a very widespread concept or idea by people who have previously been federal prosecutors who argue there is no domestic terrorism law. That's false, absolutely false. You can open the U.S. Code. There's an entire chapter called terrorism that defines both international and domestic terrorism simply by geography. Terrorism that occurs in the United States is domestic. Terrorism that occurs outside the United States is international. But they create these domestic terrorism categories by ideology. And then because they're not collecting data about who are the most persistent threats and who are the most serious threats, i.e. killing people, they're able to pick and which groups to prioritize. And they tend to prioritize groups that are engaged in less activity and less serious violence.